When is a dungeon, and does it really have to be underneath a dark cathedral or an old mansion? I say no to that, and just to reiterate my point, I show you my dungeon in the woods. So let's start with this seemingly simple question. When is a dungeon? Well, if you're just going with a common definition, you would probably want to see some cold stonework, bars, no, not those, and of course some wacky inhabitants. But if your dungeons would always follow this trope, wouldn't your adventures become very repetitive very fast? So you see, it's good to fresh up the formula a bit and look at the dungeon from a wider perspective. To do that, it's good to take a closer look at the question in the beginning. Again, the dungeon can be placed in ruins, caves, or maybe in a dark fort, but your location is only one part of the ingredient. If you look at the dungeon from a game designer's perspective, it is almost nothing but a series of challenges for your players. And to showcase this idea, I wanted to make a dungeon set that is literally somewhat of an outsider. I wanted to make a literal dungeon in the woods. I got my idea for this while painting these great metal miniatures, which I got via Kickstarter. These so-called folk horrors are modeled by Anna Polonczak, a miniature artist who has a very distinct and unique style. If you like a darker and even macabre style of miniature art, her blog Gardens of Hecate might be right up your alley. You'll find the link down in the description below. Here I also got to try out the Army Painter Speed Paints 2.0 for the first time. You may have noticed that I tend to use similar paints a lot in my paint shops, as these are a perfect fit for my workflow. I like to work with colored primers, whether it's brown, green, or like in this case, violet with a yellow zenithal and an off-white dry brush. Especially when you use transparent paints like these speed paints, you can get some really interesting results, as the underlying layers influence the paint on top. This can either add to its vibrancy or sometimes dull it down. Another great thing about these paints is that they are more universally applicable than you might see at the first glance. For example, if you need a specific highlight color and you don't own one, you can simply add a bit of hard-body acrylic white to a speed paint and get something that is much more like a standard miniature paint. I also have to add that Army Painter was so kind to send me the set of speed paints for review purposes, but everything I told you about these is my own honest opinion. So thanks to Army Painter for supporting my small channel, I really appreciate it. If you want to know more about these paints or Army Painter in general, you can follow the link down below to their channel. Also, if you like videos like this, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Here I make videos about the wonderful creative side of tabletop RPGs and wargames. Here I want to showcase new and exciting games in this area, paint miniatures, and of course build terrain and props for my games. So on that note, let us get back to the topic at hand, the forest dungeon. I wanted this terrain just as modular as my previous dungeon set. That basically meant that I wanted 3-inch or 7.5 cm long wall segments that would be arranged in varying configurations. I also wanted their footprint to be a bit broader than these walls, which are only standing upright because of these magnets and the magnetic sheet underneath the ground texture. But as I already owned the complete set of these standard ground tiles, I decided against working with magnets this time. As a base for my walls, I used these wood strips, which I still had laying around from my last dungeon project. But instead of having them stand upright, I wanted them flat. This way I would have a big enough surface that would support some trees, rocks and a bit of foliage on top of it, without getting too unstable. After cutting a bunch of strips to the right length, I used my knife and sandpaper to get smooth round edges. For a more natural looking surface, I also use bark chips, which are great for small rock formations. A trick I normally use on my miniature bases. After gluing all these chips in place, I use my power drill to drill 5 to 6 small holes to each wall segment. Each hole has a diameter of 1 millimeter, which is exactly the same diameter as these aluminium wire pieces. I wanted to use polymer clay to model each tree by hand, therefore these wires would act as armatures to wrap the clay around at a later step. Alternatively, you could use real wood sticks to act as trees, which admittedly would probably be a time and also money saver in regards to the clay. However, using Super Sculpey or Fimo gives you much more control over the finished look. You see, I wanted to give my trees a slight bow to one side. This side would be faced toward the miniatures, which would add a bit of claustrophobic look and feel to these walls. At least when you're 28 millimeters tall. I tried to fix the wires with a dab of PVA, which I also used to seal the bark. As the former worked as bad as you probably can imagine, I used a bit of Super Sculpey to have them fixed in place. After that I baked the walls at 130 degrees in my oven for about 15 minutes. Now this worked a bit better, but here and there a wire would come loose regardless. But this could be easily ignored for the next step. Beside the aluminium wire, I also added short pieces of fluorescent wire. This is much more flexible and easily wrapped around the thicker aluminium variant. I used this to add armatures for branches I wanted to add to the trees. Not too many though, as this approach was already somewhat time consuming. So I limited these to a maximum of 2 branches per tree. First I cut the wires to size and wrapped them around a single aluminium wire. This now pre-wrapped wire was then removed and simply put over a tree armature. With all the armatures in place, I started to model the trees. As I already mentioned, I used mainly Super Sculpey for this. I also tried out Fimo, but this was a bit stiffer, which might be because it's already a few years old by now. In comparison, the Super Sculpey was much more flexible and better to handle. First I modeled the tree trunks. This finally took care of the rest of the loose wires and locked those in place. After baking these, I modeled all the branches and baked them again. Here and there you might end up with fingerprints on the clay when you do it like I do here, but this can easily be rectified in the next step. At this point I only needed a bit of ground texture, which I added with Vallejo texture paste. I also used this to give the trees a bit of texture and to cover up the most egregious fingerprints. I let that dry for a few hours and went in with crackle paste. This particular paste is more than Earth by Citadel, but it really doesn't matter that much which you use for this. I applied it all over the trees and used my heat gun to give it a fast dry. When you speed up the drying time of crackle paste like this, it forms much more cracks and crinkles. I would also recommend using a hairdryer, as this heat gun can easily produce too much heat if you aim it too long at one place. This can be a huge problem, especially when you use the paste on plastic miniatures. As the last finishing touch, I added a bit of Iceland moss and locked it in place with a spray adhesive. This had also the added benefit of keeping the crackle paste where it should be. I let this thoroughly dry overnight and went to painting. First I primed every piece in brown. I also added white ink from above to get the typical zenithal illumination effect. With transparent umber and green ink, I established mainly the tone for the shrubbery. But I didn't mind the overspray on the trees and the ground. At that point I used my standard craft paints to get olive and sienna tones onto my trees, as well as this pepper grey as a highlight color. For the rocks I went back to the speed paints and based every stone and rock formation with this purple. When this was dry I dry brushed neutral grey and pepper grey onto the rocks. To round the walls off I used Vallejo pigment powders and applied them to the ground areas. I also used these pastel sticks to give a bit more visual variety in the tones. After that I sealed everything in with isopropyl alcohol, and this dungeon in the woods was ready for exploration. So you see, a dungeon doesn't need to be a dungeon. It can be an overgrown maze of wooden corridors as well. Or what do you think? Whether you agree with me or not, you have to admit that a creepy forest is definitely worthy of 1 or 2 adventures. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I really hope you enjoyed this one. If you like what I do and want to help me make more of these videos, you can support me on my Patreon. Here you get access to behind the scenes material and previews to upcoming projects. Here I also plan to give you a voice in upcoming projects by voting on certain projects. But either way, thank you for your likes, comments and maybe shares. It really means the world to me. Thank you again, and I hope to catch you on the next one. So until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.